Mr. Wynne.
Good morning. My lady, please may I call Miss Susan Ackland-Hood.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you for coming on to help us, Miss Ackland-Hood.
Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Susan Elizabeth Ackland-Hood Andrews.
Miss Ackland-Hood Andrews, is that how would you prefer if I addressed you in that way?
No, just Ackland-Hood or Susan Ackland-Hood is fine.
Oh, thank you. Miss Ackland-Hood, you ought to have in front of you 3 different witness statements, or they'll certainly come up in front of you. I'm going to take them one at a time. The first is INQ 000587823. And may I check, please, that you're content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
The second statement is INQ 00005879992. And are you content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
And the third statement is INQ 0000146054. And again, are you content that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you. I want to ask you a little bit about your background, please. I think it's right that you were the Chief Executive of Her Majesty's Court and Tribunal Service between 2016 and 2020. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that in September of 2020 you came to the Department for Education.
Yes, that's right.
And in fact, you joined in the aftermath of the assessment issue that had arisen, or had certainly become a real issue in August 2020. Is that
yes.
correct? And you joined the inquiry, understands, because Mr. Jonathan Slater had resigned.
That's not quite right. I initially was asked to come and give assistance as a temporary second permanent secretary in the department, specifically focused on addressing the exam issues. Very shortly after I joined in that second permanent secretary role, Jonathan resigned, so about 4 days after, in fact, and I was asked to become acting permanent secretary. And I then applied for the job and substantively was given it in December.
I see. I'm grateful for that clarification. But I think the important point for our purposes is that you weren't in post at the time of some of the specific events that Modulate is interested in. But you are authorised, I think, to provide evidence as to the Department for Education's assessment of those issues and reflections upon them. Is that right?
Yes, I'm very happy to speak on behalf of the department. I will be doing that from what I have gathered from documentary evidence for the portion where I wasn't there in the department.
All right. I'm being asked if you could perhaps slow down a touch. I'll try and do the same. What I wanted to do this morning, Miss Ackland-Hood, was maybe try and draw the camera back a bit from some of the issues that the inquiry has examined, and to ascertain what the Department for Education accepts, and then to seek your assistance in clarifying some of the factual issues that evidence have been given about over the past couple of weeks, but perhaps require a degree of clarity. So can I start then, please, with planning? And ask whether it's accepted by the Department for Education that although SAGE had started to provide advice from the 4th of February 2020 that there might be mass school closures, that the provision of this advice didn't prompt operational planning for the closure of schools?
Yes, I think that the department was planning on the assumption that there might be local or regional or indeed individual school closures in response to workforce challenges, but did not until quite a late stage do extensive operational planning for the full closure of all schools.
And does it also follow that that advice hadn't prompted operational planning as to how children's social care services would be provided in the event that the pandemic became more severe?
Again, I think there was quite a lot of operational planning that was based on assumptions around workforce shortage. So people were doing scenario planning based on proportions of social workers being ill, but much less planning, actually both a long time before the pandemic and in that period, was focused on the social work consequences of other infection control measures like lockdown.
So yes, so rather than thinking about operationally, what will we do if the pandemic gets worse and, for example, children aren't at school, how will social care or child protection systems be maintained in that scenario? It was that sort of planning that wasn't in place until a late stage.
Yes, I think people were planning for what happens if the pandemic gets worse and lots of social workers are ill.
Yes.
Instead.
And is it also accepted that there weren't any specific plans, in fact, for example, delineating who vulnerable children might be until in and around the 17th, 18th of March?
I think for the purposes of who might be going to be kept in school, that's true, yes.
And I think it follows from all of the evidence we've heard that because there was no planning around the prospect that schools might close until a late stage, and I think, can we check that we're on the same ground here? By a late stage, we mean 16th, 17th, yes. 18th of March, that for that reason there hadn't been any meetings with the leaders of multi-academy trusts or school leaders of local authority schools or with local authorities in order to discuss that eventuality.
In order to discuss the specific mass closure of schools, yes, correct. There were other meetings discussing other aspects, but not that.
And what, in terms of the other meetings and the other things that were being discussed in the lead up to school closures, what sort of things were being focused on at that point? So
there would have been meetings and guidance focused on infection control measures, yes, in schools, for example.
And do you accept, hopefully we won't need to go to it, but by infection control measures at that point, that was the sort of basic advice around how long you washing your hands, wiping down surfaces, that kind of advice, not infection control in the sense of there should be distancing in schools or...
Yes, it was the passing on of that, of the current public advice, yes, on infection control.
And is it accepted then that a number of consequences flowed from that? And if I may, I'll put those to you. Schools hadn't been given notice by the Department for Education that they should start to make plans for educating most children in their homes. And I mean prior to 15th, 16th, that period.
So there was standing existing guidance from the department that asked every school to have an emergency plan, including a plan for school closure. And we'd frequently managed the closure of individual schools or groups of schools in response, for example, for an individual school, it might be a buildings issue. For a group of schools, it might be a gas leak that meant that an area was evacuated. So as a standing instruction to the system, every school was expected to have an emergency plan of that kind. And we were also having conversations with schools about individual closure, and indeed small numbers of schools were closing because of illness or anxiety, or because they had an individual pupil affected and they were managing, for example, deep cleans around that. And so there were conversations going on about individual schools thinking about an individual closure, but it was predicated on the assumption that that was workforce or illness related. I think it would be fair to say it was predicated on assuming it would be for relatively short, yes, periods, not the whole system for a long period.
I mean, most people who have children at school will be familiar with snow days and the kind of very widespread events that might close schools. But again, none of that is premised on parents, for example, providing education to their children or children being educated online.
Yes, I mean, I would say actually that the guidance we give the system now does have a stronger expectation that even for a relatively short closure, there will be remote education provided.
Yes.
But at the time, that was less common.
Forgive me, I didn't want to speak over you.
Sorry.
And we'll come to what may have changed since, but I think at the time, I think I understand you're accepting that schools weren't given the forewarning that they might be required to pivot to educating children in their homes for potentially a significant period of time.
Yes, that's correct.
And do you accept that schools just weren't prepared for that wholesale pivot to having most children at home and in need of education?
I think different schools were very differently prepared. And again, I think you've heard some evidence to the inquiry on the preparations made by both some trusts and some individual schools. So my characterisation would be that preparation was very uneven and not where you would have wanted it to be.
And do you accept it was uneven because in order to provide or in order to have or achieve consistency, there does need to be guidance issued from the centre that ensures that everyone is preparing
Yes.
in the same sorts of way? And do you also accept the evidence which has emerged since that many schools in England weren't geared towards teaching online? So, for example, teachers hadn't been trained in online teaching, or schools didn't have access to the sorts of platforms, maybe, that some schools did have access to?
Yes, again, I completely accept that for the generality of the system. I think, again, for complete accuracy, there were some schools that had
Yes.
done more of that in their daily life and were better prepared than others.
I think the figures, obviously, that were provided by the Department for Education in the June of 2020 were 12,000 schools that didn't have a learning platform. I think the majority of those, to be accurate, were primary schools.
Correct.
And that 1.3 million children didn't have access to an appropriate device.
Yes.
We'll obviously come back to the impact that had on children's education. Just on the issue of the vulnerable child policy, if I may call it that, but the mitigation of allowing vulnerable children to go to school, is it accepted that another one of the consequences of the lack of planning was that there hadn't been time to engage with local authorities or school leaders of MATs or school leaders of local authority schools in order to consider the best or the potentially best ways of identifying vulnerable children?
Yes. Again, from my reading of the documents, I think there were conversations, again, about, recognising that in any emergency of this kind, it tends to be the people who are already vulnerable who suffer the most. I think there were conversations that were going on about trying to make sure that we were heavily focusing on vulnerable children, but on that specific issue of identifying people to attend school in a mass closure, that's correct.
Well, I think it's more about being able to have the conversations in advance.
Yes.
In order to think about how there's the messaging issue that I'll come to,
Yes.
but I think understanding from schools, and from, if I say schools in general, if I mean leaders and local authorities, in order to understand potentially who do they say the most vulnerable children are. If we're categorising vulnerable children, are there children who we are missing? And if we're affording a discretion, are there specific groups of children that schools think we ought to be including in the guidance as well? So it's the lost opportunity for those sorts of conversations. Yes. And then also that schools missed the opportunity to have conversations with families in advance of the announcement being made that schools would close about the prospect, for example, that their child might come into school.
Yes. I'm pausing on that one because I think that, and again, the department has accepted in all of our corporate statements that there should have been more planning both a long way in advance and in that immediate period. I think the communication of the expectation that schools might be about to close in that very short-term period, I think would have remained problematic even if the planning had been done. And again, I've thought about this quite carefully. I think that ideally you would do that planning not in the heat of a growing crisis, because I genuinely do think there are difficult choices to be made at a point where you are seeking to keep schools open as long as possible. And again, there was a principle that I don't think was firmly established until summer 2020, but which was that school is so important to the lives of children that you want it to be one of the very last things you close and one of the very first things you open in trying to manage spread. And when you decide that, you almost by definition put schools at the frontier. You put them at the point where you're going to be making decisions both to open and to close at a cusp point where it's difficult to make that decision. And so I think talking to people about being about to close before you get to that point, when people are anxious and in the midst of it, was a difficult decision to make, and I think would have been a difficult decision to make even in the presence of more detailed planning. And that was true, I think, in the run-up to in December and January, where there was more planning, but it still felt very difficult to signal that without accidentally catalysing it before the moment where people had decided the decision had to be made. And so I again, I'm sorry, I'll stop in a minute. I think my reflection is we should have done more sharing, we should have engaged people better, but the absolute best time to have done that would have been further in advance as part of more detailed contingency planning, such that when you got into the crisis moment, people had more of that understanding at their fingertips, rather than doing it in that crisis moment.
Yes.
And I know the best time to plant an oak tree is 100 years ago, and the second best time is now. But I do think there's something about that decision making in those very fraught moments.
Decision making at an inflection point
Correct.
may not have the outcome that you, or let's be accurate about this. It's not decision making, it's
sharing.
Consultation and sharing information at an inflection point may lead to consequences that are not intended. But just sticking with here, does that mean that what you're suggesting is that in a future pandemic, and I'm putting aside long-term planning for a future pandemic, but you really need to start to have those conversations before you're heading towards the tipping point?
Yes.
So here in February, when you could have a calm conversation and say, that we haven't reached this point yet.
Yes.
But if we were to reach it, here are the sorts of things that you need to do.
Yes.
A number of witnesses before the inquiry have talked about the potentially stigmatising effect of the messaging about vulnerable children, or as the director from Kent Social Services described it, almost anger on the part of people. You're telling everyone else their children shouldn't go to school, so why should mine? Do you accept again that was one of the consequences of the lack of planning, that there hadn't been time to think about how that message would be provided to people if this policy was going to be implemented?
I certainly think more planning would have given more time to think about the messaging. I'm not sure I'd make the direct connection with a sense of stigma, partly because I think that reluctance of people to send their children, particularly in the first lockdown, was more related to perceptions around safety than stigma. And we see that both in surveys that were carried out and in what happened in January, where I don't think there was a reason why stigma would have been different, but perceptions of safety were, and the numbers were very different.
So again, if we just stick on that issue for a moment, do you accept, though, that the messaging and putting it in terms of vulnerability was nonetheless potentially a barrier to some people sending their children to school, and that different kinds of messaging needed to be provided in order to get more children into school in the early part of the pandemic.
I think more time to plan would have allowed us to do better work on the messaging, certainly.
Because, I mean, I think witnesses like the Children's Commissioner, I think, have said it could have been framed in a much more positive way. In other words, there could have been ways to convey this to families that didn't make it seem as though it were punitive or that it was an unsafe thing to do.
Yes, I hesitate on that because I think I don't see anything in the department's messaging from that time that made it look punitive, and there was quite a lot of care taken to make the point that schools were not closing because they were unsafe, but because there was a need to reduce overall community transmission. I think, again, however, I completely accept your point that more time would have allowed more thought, work and consultation on trying to make sure the messaging was as good as it could have been. I think it would still have been difficult. I think the overarching message to society at that time was so strongly that the right thing to do was to stay at home, that you were going to have difficulty persuading people not to.
But do you accept that's not inexorable, because that will be the position? Because the concern is obviously that it leaves very, very many very vulnerable children in potentially dangerous situations, and that everything does need to be done to try and get those children into a safe place during these sorts of periods.
I think it would have been much better if there'd been earlier planning. I think we could have done better messaging, and I think that might well have helped. I'm just not sure it would have been the silver bullet. I think it would have remained difficult.
All right, and maybe we can come and consider some of the issues that might have made a difference.
Yes.
In January 2021. Can I just turn then to the issue that has been raised with a number of witnesses, which is the position of children who had education, health and care plans, and trying to understand what the rationale for allowing on the face of the policy those children to attend school was. And if I can just premise the question by saying that, and the inquiries looked at the guidance from March, April, and I think this follows through into the guidance of May 2020 as well, that on the face of the policies, it said that children with an education, health and care plan could attend school, but the policy then qualified it effectively by saying the test, and I mean test in a sense of a test in guidance, was whether or not children with an ECHP whose personal care needs couldn't be met at home could go to school. And so that's the premise. And first of all, was that the intention of the policy, that really only a subset of children with education, health and care plans should attend school?
So I think there were two aims in allowing children with an education and health and care plan to attend school. The first was around care and safety, and recognising that some of those children would get better care and be safer at school because of the needs that they had. And I think there was a second concern, which was around the provision of their education, which again, in general, for a child with an education, health and care plan, is better provided in school. And in a sense, the essence of the education, health and care plan being in place is that they need specialist provision in order to be able to get good access to their education. I think the balance between those two aims shifted from the very first iteration of the guidance. I think it actually shifted quite quickly, but I think the very first iteration of the guidance was heavily counted towards care and safety. And so there were the phrasing you describe was in there, as well as some phrasing that essentially said if they could be safely supported at home, they should be, which I think tilted towards a default of kind of at home unless they need to be at school. I think we quite quickly, and sorry, I say we as the department, I think the department quite quickly saw that numbers attending were very low and were concerned about that. And sorry, the other thing I should say is across government there was there was high concern when writing the list of key workers who would be able to send their children to school and making these decisions, that there would be too many people in schools for effective infection control. And very early on, that was the biggest concern. And it very quickly pivoted because it became clear that actually not very many people were going to school, to a concern about there not being enough children who were vulnerable and would be better off in school. And so you can see that when we published the updated guidance on the 19th of April 2020, we changed the wording quite significantly. And I don't think it was just wording, actually. I think the underlying intent shifted. And so that guidance said, and I have an INQ number if you would like, INQ 000519887. And that guidance says the government encourages vulnerable children and young people to attend educational settings unless they have underlying health conditions that put them at severe risk. So it changed that presumption. It also set out specific expectations for each of children and young people with a social worker, children and young people with an education, health and care plan, and children and young people who are otherwise vulnerable. And on the... Joy, do you want me to pause?
No, I'm just... We need to just go to the page number, which
of course,
I have.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. You've just raced slightly ahead of me.
So 0003.
It's page 3.
So at the top, just below those two bullets, the government encourages vulnerable children and young people to attend educational settings unless they have, unless they have underlying health conditions that put them at severe risk. Thank you very much indeed.
So if we carry on with that and look at the next sentence, during the coronavirus outbreak, vulnerable children and young people are defined as those. So we have the first one, effectively children who have a social worker. And then the second bullet is have an education, health and care plan whose needs cannot be met safely in the home environment. So it's not a test that puts it the other way round and asks, risk assess whether or not this child can safely attend school. It's still premised on children whose needs. Do you see the point?
Yes, I do. If you go to the next page, 004,
yes,
you have specific expectations for children with an education, health and care plan. I agree with you. It has that starting headline that says cannot be met safely in the home environment. But it then says, again, the second paragraph underneath expectations on attendance, where the risk assessment determines a child or young person with an EHC plan will be as safe or safer in an educational setting, it may be more appropriate for them to attend. So it's starting to shift, and it then shifts further. And I think the key thing to say is that we can see a shift in the attendance of children between the writing of this guidance and the next attendance figures. So at the 17th of April, the estimate was that about 5% of vulnerable children and young people were attending on site. After the publication of these guidance, the next figures were on the 24th of April 2020. And the estimate then was that 10% were attending, so approximately a doubling in the attendance of vulnerable children and young people. I think it is still far lower than you would want, to be clear, but the department was seeking from this point, and then in further iterations of the guidance, you see that balance shift further towards attendance. And again, I think there was a real challenge here in trying to get the balance right between children's safety, education, managing the fact that there was still quite a lot of uncertainty, that as well as children with an education, health and care plan often needing that school support, there was also a very large overlap with children who at that stage were being told that they were clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable, and people were trying to manage that balance and that shifting picture.
I think that's understood, but I think it's just not clear why a simple test that said risk assess whether or not this child can safely go to school rather than the other way round would have answered that.
I have to say I tend to agree with you.
And the other issue that has come up in respect of this is obviously the risk assessment itself and the evidence that some children either weren't being risk assessed and that was evidence that I think the Children's Commissioner had gathered during this period. And then the Ofsted evidence as well, that some children who were entitled to go to school were still not being offered places. And I think the issue that goes to is how, in this sort of situation, the government monitors the implementation of these kinds of policies and knows if there are problems in their implementation, which may not be clear because these are decisions being made by individual institutions. Is that a matter that the Department for Education has reflected on since the pandemic?
Yes, and I think, Ofsted, of course, is part of the answer to that question. So the reason Ofsted are able to opine on that is because they were working closely with local authorities and looking at that. And both in emergency situations and in normal business, the department has to think very carefully about where you have duties that apply to schools or to local authorities, how you make sure that you've got assurance that the duties are being carried out, but how you do that in a way that doesn't remove responsibility from the body that holds the duty. And we think about that a lot.
Yes. Yeah. But is it accepted that, and thinking about the context of a pandemic, that there does need to be a better way to ensure that that intelligence is coming to the Department for Education quickly so that it's understood there is a blockage in the implementation of the policy we've enacted?
So I think one of the reflections, so there were a set of places where data flows were a challenge before and during the pandemic, on many of which we actually used the pandemic as a spur to try and put much better data systems in place subsequently. That's still a work in progress. But I think often having good, transparent and relatively real-time data can really help with those challenges of making sure that you are getting assurance without being overbearing on a system that is working hard under difficult circumstances.
I'm going to move on. I wanted to check that before I do. The inquiry's obviously heard evidence about Section 42 being adjusted so that the duties on local authorities to provide requirements in education, health and care plans was abrogated and the duty became one of reasonable endeavours. The inquiry understands from the evidence that the rationale for that was that these were the sorts of services or therapies that children might be offered in school, and if they weren't in school, they weren't getting them. And I think the issue that has arisen that doubly disadvantaged these children because of the way the policy was working and because of the need of a risk assessment, which meant that they weren't at school, and then at the same time, because they weren't at school, they weren't getting what was offered. What they had previously been entitled to.
Yes, and I think there's a reason that the department didn't make a similar set of provisions when it came to the January lockdown, where the approach that was taken was a little more, if the child cannot get the provision that they need not in school, then we should do everything we possibly can to support them to be in school and to get that provision. I think some of this is not about the level of preparation, it's about the deep uncertainty that there was during that very early pandemic period. Uncertainty about safety, not just of individual children, but of different procedures and processes. So, for example, there was an enormous amount of work the department did on aerosol generating procedures which are needed for some children and young people, where there was real uncertainty about the safety for the child and young person and for the person administering the process, and uncertainty about workforce impact. So again, as it turned out, although many schools and colleges and children's social work teams did really hard work during the pandemic with staffing pressure and difficulty, the kinds of staffing level drops that we had been asked to plan for and that people thought might transpire didn't come to pass. And so it's quite easy to look back on it and say, well, it looks like there were enough people that you could have done all of those things and you didn't need to disapply it. That really wasn't clear at the point when those provisions were put in place. And we were trying to strike the right balance between making sure children got everything that they possibly could and not leaving people in a position where they were forced into unlawfulness because it was impossible to do the thing that was asked.
But is there a lesson to be learned from that about preempting or making changes to children's rights and entitlements before there is evidence that it's actually required? Because I think that was an issue that also arose in respect of the coronavirus regulations, where it seemed to be assumed that there would be a need for the changes that were made. But I think that the department's position is they weren't used because they weren't needed.
Yes, I think there's definitely a lesson to be learnt about that, although I would, on the coronavirus regulations, I don't think it was an assumption that was made. I think it was something we were being asked for rather powerfully by states. There were meetings with ADCS, Local Government Association, and those changes were specifically asked for because people thought that they would be needed. So it wasn't. I don't think it's fair to say the department assumed it. I think a very large gathering of people who were responsible for the provision of those services agreed. I actually think the key mistake there was that we were speaking to the providers, the producers, and we didn't engage children's charities and children's rights organisations directly in those conversations to make sure we were looking at both halves of that. I say that I'm very, very clear that those producer organisations were trying to do the right thing for children. I don't think they were trying to sort of do something they shouldn't, but I think we would have had better preparatory discussions if we'd engaged a wider group of people in them. But I don't think it's fair to say the department assumed it was needed. The department asked for the changes.
Yes, and maybe that's a question of the department testing more whether or not those changes are needed. And I think the position in adult social care was different because there was a need to demonstrate workforce shortages, but that wasn't the position when it came to children.
Yes, and I think that is exactly the sort of thing we have learnt from and would do differently in a future pandemic.
Can I just ask you then just about children more, the much broader cohort of children who might be described as vulnerable, not in a technical sense of the term, but the inquiry has seen the analysis that was prepared by the Children's Commissioner for England, I think in 2018 and 2019. And I can take you to it in your bundle, Miss Eglinton, if you want to see it, but I don't think this is controversial. Yeah. That the Children's Commissioner, on her analysis, thought there were about 2.3 million children who would fall within her categorisation of vulnerability. Those being children who live with one of the three of the toxic trio factors for childhood adversity. And we've seen some evidence that the Department for Education calculated it on a lower basis. And first of all, I wanted to check whether it was accepted that there was a much broader cohort of children who would fall potentially within a definition of vulnerability than that was set out in the department's guidance.
Yes, and that was the reason for the other vulnerable category. I just say one thing about the Children's Commissioner's analysis. So I think we completely accept that there's a much wider category of children who could be described as vulnerable. I think Indra Morris, in giving evidence to the inquiry, raised questions about the use of the term vulnerable, and I have to say I personally share that uneasiness about the use of the term, but I'll use it for ease. The Children's Commissioner's analysis looks at a number of factors, including children in low income, for which she uses the definition of free school meals. She then adds up groups of children who suffer from all of those different kinds of vulnerabilities. And then some statistical analysis is done to try and remove overlaps because, of course, they are heavily overlapping groups.
Yes.
She then subtracts from that children in contact with children's social care and identifies a group that are not in touch with children's social care but might be otherwise vulnerable. And we accept all of that analysis. The one thing I would say is that a very large proportion of that group will be children on free school meals. And of course, schools do know which children are on free school meals. So it's true that the school might not know, for example, that the child is a child of a prisoner. But I don't think it's quite right to suggest that the school would be unaware of any form of vulnerability for all of those children in that identified group, because the free school meals category is so large and overlaps with so many of those other characteristics.
So
and I don't say that to be difficult or to question her analysis. I think her analysis is very useful, but it's been bothering me a bit that we haven't been clear about that.
The composition.
Quite significant overlap.
Of that vulnerable group. So I think the department's own narrow estimate for vulnerable children, I think is it 1.9 million children on a narrower measure.
Yes, and again, it's not. It's a slightly different composition of factors, and I don't think we would ever suggest there was a sort of hard boundary of. And again, it's one of the reasons why the vulnerable term is slightly difficult. I mean, these things exist on spectrums. Also, people can have extremely satisfying, effective and fulfilling lives. Even while in these categories, they can have excellent parenting. People can be extremely supportive despite being in one of these categories. And so they're strong indicators of risk that you want to be attentive to and think about. But I don't think they should be used as a sort of label, a definitive label of kind of lack of safety in the home, for example.
I think that what in fact this really goes to is the calculation of the attendance of vulnerable children at school and having a much better understanding of the risks that children are exposed to when they're not at home. Because the Department for Education statistics were measuring children with a social worker and children with an ECHP.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask whether it's accepted that that's an underestimate of the number of children who would have been vulnerable or at risk during the pandemic.
Yes, it is. I think that particularly children with a social worker is a good proxy for the group where there was the clearest knowledge that there was likely to be some risk to them in the home. Almost by definition, because if we know that there's a risk to a child in the home, we use those procedures around the children's social care system.
Yes, but you understand there's lots of children on the cusp of care. There are lots of children who receive services that are less than the statutory services in order to prevent them escalating to be in that position.
Yes.
Can I just come on then, please, to a separate issue, which is the one that you've just touched on, which is that of consultation, and use the coronavirus regulations as an example of that. And first to ask whether it's accepted that the way that those regulations were enacted was entirely asymmetrical in terms of consultation, that consultation was only with those organisations who sought the relaxation of those statutory requirements as opposed to organisations who might speak to the consequences of them.
Yes, I think that's right. I think there was an attempt to engage informally with the Children's Commissioner, but as the Court of Appeal found in the judicial review, that was inadequate, and we accept that.
And the inquiry has looked at the correspondence from around this period and has seen that the Children's Commissioner was writing to the Department for Education on the 6th of April, precisely on the point that the guidance that had just been published left a void because it informed, it stated that local authorities may well I'm summarising, may well not be able to meet their statutory obligations, and didn't say anything about what those statutory obligations were. Yes. So that she had written on that very issue, and these were the regulations that were going to fill that
Yes.
void. And it's difficult to understand why, in those circumstances, putting to one side that she is the Children's Commissioner, why she would have been left out of the consultation.
So I think that, and again, remembering that I'm doing this on the basis of the documents
Yes.
that I've seen, my understanding is that there were informal conversations with the Children's Commissioner, and that the team at the time thought that they were engaging her, but that was short of a formal consultation with her, and that the court judged that that was insufficient, and we accept that judgment.
When you say engagement with her, do you mean the email that was sent on the 16th of April?
It is my understanding that there was other engagement with her.
Right. Well, I don't think we've heard anything about that, but nonetheless, it's accepted. As the Court of Appeal said, the regulations were unlawful for that reason.
Yes.
And it's still very, I'm not sure I quite understand. There had been consultation, albeit informal. Are you suggesting that the Children's Commissioner had in fact been treated in the same way as local authorities and the service providers who had been consulted?
So there wasn't a formal consultation of any kind. So everyone who was consulted informally. I think there was more conversation with, and again, I do this on the basis of the documents that I've been provided with. I think that there had been more discussion and consultation with those who were putting forward the measures, but it's not that there was a formal consultation process from which she was omitted. It was that the work was being done at enormous pace and people were trying to engage as quickly as they could. It is my view that if we had time to ring up and talk to the ADCS, we had time to ring up and talk to a wider range of children's organisations, not just the Children's Commissioner, actually. As it happens, I think people did try and have that informal engagement with the Children's Commissioner, but I don't actually think that. I think we should have sought to have at least that informal level of consultation more widely. That's my view.
I'm going to move on to an entirely separate, albeit related issue away from consultation, and it's just to understand the position about the social work guidance that was provided on the 6th of May. So I think, first of all, it's right to say that that guidance was intended to fill the void that had existed until that point, in terms of making absolutely clear what statutory obligations could be no longer had to be met in the way that they had been put before, yes. And that guidance put some guardrails around the exercise of those around the exercise of those regulations as well, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
It required sign-off and all the rest, and those other things we see in the guidance. But the concern is that the other visits that guidance applied to, so the other forms of everyday social work visits, that those safety rails didn't apply to that, and indeed appeared to presume that social work visits would be remote unless it was necessary. So again, instead of it being the other way round, you should use remote visits only if it's necessary.
Yes.
Do you accept that?
Yes, I do.
And do you accept that the guidance such as it was issued was just didn't contain the safeguards that were necessary in order to ensure that social work practice was consistent and was being carried out in a way that ensured child protection was maintained?
I think what it sought to do was protect the highest priority work and allow flexibility so that social workers could prioritise. So the challenge with some of the statutory timescales was that they risked requiring social workers to go and do the thing that was about to be out of time rather than the most presentingly urgent thing. So I think the intent was to allow social workers to focus on the things that would allow them to safeguard children best. I think, again, this is another case in which people were worrying about both a set of workforce challenges and a set of challenges around acceptability of face-to-face visits to families, not just to the social workers, that risked putting people in a place where even when they were trying to do the right thing, they were found to have been unlawful. And this guidance essentially reflected those regulations and, as you say, put those guardrails around it. It did seek to say, where you're worried about risk, you should prioritise face-to-face. But you're right, it carried the implication that other things would default to remote. Yes. And I think that is, again, I really understand why that was the position at that time. Again, if you think back, the kind of the whole thrust of everything that we were being asked to do was for as many people as possible to stay at home, to do your work from home if you possibly could. Again, I think this is one of those where, having lived through that, you might well, again, if you were faced with exactly the same pandemic, which, again, I'm always conscious we need to make sure we aren't over-planning for exactly the same thing we've just experienced, but I think you might do something different. I think you might push harder that you go face-to-face unless you can't, rather than the other way around.
Yes, or you reverse the presumption. Exactly. And you
yes.
put a consistent, you put yes. some clear principles around yes. deviating from the norm of social work practice.
Yes.
The other issue in relation to this is obviously the really practical one of PPE.
Yes.
And about providing guidance that's actually realistic about what might happen on the doorstep. So can I just deal with those two things as yes. well? Did this guidance also reflect the fact that there were shortages in PPE as well? Or was that a concern at this point?
It was. We were working very hard to make sure PPE was prioritised for the children's social workforce, and we were relatively successful in that, I would say. But we were always conscious. I mean, again, this was a period in which everyone representing any workforce that was still in face-to-face contact with anybody was clamouring for PPE, and so there was a sort of enormous cross-government. I was about to use the word bun fight, but that's probably not helpful. It was better than that. There was a process in which everybody could see the really clear need for their workforces to have PPE, and there was a really difficult exercise, in my view, being done to try and rank those needs in order and get as much PPE to the people who need it most as possible. And we did quite well at getting children's social workers to the top of that list, but we were acutely conscious that it was, there was far more demand than supply as a whole, and so we couldn't I think at this stage it would be fair to say we couldn't necessarily guarantee that if we had pushed for everything to be done face-to-face, we could have said there would definitely be enough PPE to make that happen. So we were trying to give flexibility. I think you could have given that flexibility still with the default the other way round,
yes.
and it might have been better. But I think people were acutely conscious of those practical difficulties.
All right. I'm going to move on to a new topic, which is that of impact assessments, and specifically equality impact assessments as well. I think, can we see if we can do this without necessarily needing to go to one, just so that the inquiry can understand the Department for Education's perspective on equality assessments. I don't think there's any dispute. There wasn't an equality assessment carried out prior to the closure of schools.
Yes.
I think we have a draft one that was carried out sometime after. I'm not sure it's clear if it was finalised.
It was written. It was written at the same time as the impact assessment for reopening in June, and it was done because the public sector equality duty. I mean, again, you of course know this, but applies not just to moments of decision making, but to all of the exercise of the functions of any public authority, and so. The judgment was it was much better to write one in detail when we could, and then make sure that in the implementation we were going back round and seeing whether we could do even more. Again, the writing of the assessment isn't the thing that fulfills the duty. The duty is fulfilled by giving due consideration at the moment that the decision is made. But as a department, we tend to find the writing of those assessments helpful as well as necessary in trying to make sure we're doing our job as well as we can.
Yes, and because they can be important for identifying mitigations as
yes.
well. But can I just come back to equality impact assessments and their potential limitations in relation to children? I mean, the first limitation that may be particularly relevant to children is that socioeconomic disadvantage isn't a protected characteristic, yet it is one of the most important characteristics that affects children's development, education, and many of the other issues that you're concerned with, correct?
Yes.
And the second, perhaps inherent limitation is that the characteristic of age isn't a protected characteristic when it comes to the provision of services either. So
yes, and I mean, as you can see in the impact assessments we wrote, we tend to write the impact assessment as if it is because it's helpful, but you're right, that's not part of the legal duty.
And also an equality impact assessment is about comparing protected characteristics as well, which is of less use in a pandemic situation because those things may be of much less interest. What you're really interested in is just impact on children.
Yes.
Which obviously raises or points to the importance of child rights impact assessments as an alternative tool. Do you agree?
So I certainly think that there's value in making sure that impact on children is being considered. The department do use children's rights impact assessments, and we find it a helpful tool in many circumstances. I suppose the other, and again, this is covered in the legislation on equalities impact assessments, but you always have to guard against the sort of writing of the assessment substituting for the thinking really deep embedded in the decision itself. And so my only question about the use of children's rights impact assessments is whether what you actually want is for the core of the decision to be focused on children's rights, which I would actually argue a lot of the decisions the department took during the pandemic were kind of deep focused on the rights and interests of the child. But I mean, I agree with your reflections on the limitations of equality impact assessments in focusing on disadvantage.
But I think what you're saying is that if rights assessments are to be used as a meaningful tool, then they do have to properly reflect all of the implications, for example, of a policy on children in a way that is meaningful and realistic.
Yes, and I think I'm saying that you want to make the requirement around it compatible with the real world decision making that happens. And again, I say this carefully, but there is a trade-off between a requirement that and again, I do feel this a little bit in respect of equalities impact assessments. There's a trade-off between a requirement that asks you to consider every one of an extremely long list of things, some of which may be more or less relevant to the specific decision being taken, and how far it is easy to genuinely get a decision maker to think about all of those things, including when they may not be that relevant to the core of the decision being taken. So there's something about, and again, the legislation does actually cover this, but there's something about our practice in doing it and the way we set it up to encourage this. There's something about proportionality and and I don't mean not caring about equalities or children's rights. I mean really focusing on the things where you're going to make the biggest difference, have the biggest impact, and making sure that is at the centre of the decision maker's consideration. And that can sometimes be easier if you're not required to present those things in a list of everything you can think of, yes, as opposed to with focus on them.
Can I just check that I've understood you? I think maybe, does that go to the sort of comparative exercise that you have in an equality impact assessment, whereby those comparisons may not mean very much in the context of the decision you're making?
I think it goes to the comparative part, and it also sometimes goes to, and again, I say this carefully because I do think there's something about the logical exercise of being required to think about everything that is helpful, but for a decision maker, for example, taking decisions about school closures in a pandemic, there are some things where the impact is so great that it genuinely should be weighed up against the risk of mass fatality. And there are a whole lot of other things that just aren't ever going to seriously be considered. I mean, sorry, even if they were considered seriously, it wouldn't be for very long in contrast to that. And again, I hesitate to give an example, but the question is, how do you make sure that in the moment of actually making those very difficult decisions, you are able to focus remorselessly on those things that have really big, really serious impacts that genuinely might shift your decision making on those really material points. And sorry, I will shut up in a minute. I'm sorry, but I've thought about this quite a lot. But there's something about how you frame a requirement or a provision, both so that it's comprehensive and so that it's proportionate, that I think is hard and bears consideration.
Can I just separate out? I think there are two.
Before you do, I've been asked twice now to ask you to slow down.
I'm so sorry.
I didn't know after the first time, because like me, you speak very quickly. So I wasn't to criticise myself. But if you could, be really great.
I'm so sorry. I will.
Just on that,
to write myself a note.
I think that on that issue you've just raised, Ms Eklund-Hood, you may have jumped to an issue that Modulate has been exploring, which is the question of where you measure or where you balance children's rights against precisely the sort of other interests and rights that you've just described. So if you're considering schools, when you're considering the closure of schools because of the potential impact it might have on broader transmission of a disease, where does that thinking and where does that weighing up and balancing take place? The inquiry has seen the evidence of the Children's Commissioner writing to SAGE to suggest or to ask why are children's interests not being taken into account in that forum. So can I ask you about that first? The Department for Education was represented on the Children's Task and Finish group,
yes,
wasn't it? So is it correct that in fact, insofar as there was a voice for children's interests or a voice that was able to say this will have terrible consequences for children's education, it was reflected in SAGE, or certainly in the Children's Task and Finish group? So
yes, I mean the department was part of the setting up of the Children's Task and Finish group. I think SAGE is not a decision-making body. SAGE is an advisory body focused on medical and health evidence. And so principally we were listening at SAGE, not talking, because we aren't the holders of the medical and health expertise. I think the more important point was that SAGE were providing one lens, that we needed to make sure that children's health was being considered and was being considered in the broadest frame, but that there would be non-health related considerations as well. And I don't think the right mechanism would have been to try and feed those in through SAGE. I think that was about combining the SAGE evidence on health with other evidence and perspectives. And I think you can see the department doing that throughout the pandemic, seeking to say, what about the other impacts on children? Again, at some of the most difficult moments where the health advice is starting to say some more restriction in society is needed in order to manage the pandemic, the department, certainly from the summer onwards, was consistently saying, yes, and interfering with children's education is the last thing you should do when you're trying to identify the mechanisms for controlling that spread.
And I think the issue then is, I think the first issue, and it's the one that's been raised in evidence, is whether or not the Department for Education was sufficiently, I hesitate to use the term in the room, but whether or not it was sufficiently integrated into the main decision-making processes. And I think that means Downing Street, in order to ensure that those interests were properly taken into account. Has the Department for Education reflected on whether or not it did have the role it ought to have had when those really significant decisions were made?
So I think in general, the department did have a good voice. I think there are two things that I would say about that which are relevant. The first is actually back to the topic of pre-pandemic planning and the way that government as a whole thinks about its resilience and rapid response planning. And I think this was true before the pandemic and for quite a lot of the course of the pandemic. The starting assumption was that the key people to have in the room were the owners of the presenting risk. In other words, the Department for Health, because it was a health risk. Again, you can also see this in some of the exercises that have run since. So, for example, the department, again, I may get the precise name wrong because it's changed, but the Department for Energy and Net Zero in response to risks around power. And the Department for Education doesn't hold many causes of risk. We have some, but mainly we're a department that holds really big society-wide downstream impacts of those risks. And quite a lot of the sort of structures and the setup around resilience before the pandemic, during the early part of the pandemic, assumed the key people you had in the room were the kind of risk-causing people, not the risk-impacted people. And we've now had that conversation in those terms really clearly with the Resilience Secretariat, and they've shifted that fundamental set of assumptions. So we have not just a seat at the table when there's something being decided about children, but an assumption that we should be a core part of resilience preparations and contingency planning. And again, we've been exercising that over the last couple of weeks through exercise Pegasus, which I think may have been mentioned by others to the inquiry. We do see a different approach. I think that's also about the department's own capacity and capability. So because of that starting assumption, we didn't really see ourselves as a department that needed a big infrastructure around, a big standing infrastructure around resilience. We now have a very good, and I pay them tribute, they've done a huge amount of work in support of me today, resilience team in the department, and a much stronger set of structures. The second thing is, I think there were a small number of extremely high-profile decisions that directly affected children where it was odd that the department was not in the room when the decision was taken.
And do you mean the decision to close schools in March 2020? the decision to close schools in January 2021.
Yes, I do.
So essentially the biggest decisions
Yes.
that affected the Department for Education.
Yes.
And it wasn't in the room.
And I both understand that, and again, I do think it comes down to this point of having decided that is the last thing you're going to do. You're going to be doing that in the most extreme crucible moments. But I nevertheless think that it would have been better to have the Secretary of State for Education in the room.
And do you think that's a reflection of it being an in extremis situation, or a reflection of children's interests and rights not being properly afforded the importance that they ought to be when those decisions have the capacity to change their lives effectively?
I think it's about those being very extreme moments. I think it's about everybody involved thinking they knew how to worry about children's rights themselves without someone else needing to tell them. I think there's, and again, this is a sort of, I have to be careful because this can be a slightly tedious refrain of government. I think, and I've worked in the centre of government as well as in departments, but there's a bit of a tendency when you work in the centre to assume you know what departments are going to say and that you have enough expertise without them to take many decisions. And there's a tendency when you work in departments to assume that the centre doesn't have nearly the expertise it thinks it has and really need your expert advice. And sitting as I am currently in department, I would say that it was less a risk that the people taking the decision in the centre didn't care about or take seriously children's rights. It was that they thought they had the information that they needed without the department in the room.
Thank you. Just 1 second. Oh, it's 4 more minutes to the break time. And maybe we can make a start on it's a related topic to what you've discussed, but it goes to events that I think you were closely involved in, and the inquiry would be assisted by your evidence on it, and that is the events leading up to the 4th of January 2021.
I think this is so important.
That we'll have a break.
And given the stenographer has been struggling this morning, I think we'll take the break now. I think you've been warned about our breaks, Ms. Lackland-Hood, and I shall return at past.
All rise.
Ms. Dobbin.
Thank you. Ms. Ackland, before that adjournment, we were turning to the issue of January 2021 and the events leading up to school closures, and specifically the issue relating to mass testing. And it's really that I want to focus on and see if we can clarify some of the events. Shall we see if we can manage without the documents, but if we do, we can turn to them. The inquiry saw that on the 4th of December, I think it was a COVID-0 meeting took place, and the issue of mass testing was discussed. And it was said at that point that the task force was supportive of the proposal for testing in schools, but said that the Department for Education didn't have robust delivery plans or clarity on funding. Are you familiar with that meeting and the note to which I'm referring, or would you like to see it?
Yes, no, that's fine. I'm familiar. So I think, and my lady, the inquiry, I'd really like to set out this sequence of events around mass testing, and I'll try and do it really slowly.
Before you start, if I interrupt at any point, it's because it may be that you're coming to a point that I was going to ask you about, where I think there is, or the inquiry thinks there is a lack of clarity. So if I interrupt you, it's for that reason.
Of course, and you should do exactly what you need to do. I'm just really keen to help with this bit because I think it's quite confusing. So I think the fundamental confusion arises because there were several different plans for mass testing in quick succession. So I was just going to try and lay those out, and then perhaps we can look at particulars in relation to them. So I'm going to start in October 2020, when DFE worked with DHSC and Public Health England on piloting of mass asymptomatic lateral flow device testing, both in universities and in schools and colleges. And two different things were being tested. One was what was called test to find. So this was effectively mass or widespread testing of asymptomatic people to see if more positive COVID cases could be found and then managed. The second thing was what is quite often in the papers referred to as serial testing. And that is using testing instead of self-isolation when there's a positive case. So if someone tested positive, rather than all of their contacts having to isolate for a long period, the contacts would instead take 7 consecutive days of lateral flow tests. And both of those two things were tested in the pilot. And the pilots were supported by health colleagues and by the military in terms of the administration and management of that for schools and HEIs.
Ms. Ackland, it might help just before you proceed with that, just to clarify, the pilot was relatively small,
yes.
Wasn't it? It wasn't. It might give the impression, if you talk about a pilot, that it's all over the country and lots of schools, but it wasn't.
No, it was very small. It was to establish whether the principle worked.
Yes.
And it was promising. And at that stage in October, we were particularly interested in the serial testing aspect because we could see at that stage that there were many more children missing school because they were self-isolating than because they were ill. And so the proposal, that piloting led to two things. The first thing was the deployment of mass testing in universities for the return from university before Christmas. And that was piloted on a wider scale, and then it was rolled out. So the announcement was made on the 11th of November that there would be on-site lateral flow testing in universities as students went home to try and make sure that that return of students didn't spread COVID. And that was carried out. So test kits were deployed to universities, they set up testing centres, students were tested and they went home. So by the time we get into this December period, one important thing to remember is that we have done this in universities. There's a lot more schools and universities, but we're not starting from scratch. The proposal that went to COVID-0, and this is the 10th of December meeting, so this is the meeting after the one that you referred to, was to set up testing sites on school and college sites to deliver lateral flow testing, and it was specifically to do testing on return to secondary schools of school and college staff, so not students at this stage, just staff, and to introduce serial testing of close contacts. And that at that stage was still somewhat dependent on MHRA approval, but it was expected. So what we were planning for and standing up on the 10th of December was something that required a test site in every school, but not the regular or on-return test of every pupil. It was staff, and then it was serial testing for staff and students. And that's important because the numbers are very different. So if you're only testing contacts, you don't need nearly as many tests as if you're testing every student either once on return or regularly. You can see in the papers that having worked on that very closely with DHSC, they wanted to withdraw, they didn't want the paper presented as joint.
Can I just be clear, just so that we're not losing the thread, which paper it is you're talking about?
This is the paper that was presented to COVID-O on the 10th of December. Yes. And my recollection and understanding from the papers is that that was principally because the Secretary of State for Health, on seeing the paper that morning, said that he wanted it to go further and for there to be more testing. And that was quite challenging for the team because up until that point, the main interaction with health had been about whether or not enough lateral flow devices could be made available to do the testing that was already proposed. So we had, again, and I understand all of these positions, incidentally, we had officials saying, you've got this big plan for testing. We're also seeking to roll out very widespread, there were a whole series of plans for very widespread community testing. We don't know if we can give you enough kits to do the school testing you're proposing. And we'd been negotiating that with them and trying to get to the point where we could do what was in this proposal. And then when the Secretary of State for Health saw it, he wanted there to be more testing. In the meantime, they did agree this proposal, and we announced it on the 15th of December. And on that proposal, we'd had quite a lot of discussion with school partners. There was anxiety about school staff delivering the tests, but because of the scale of it and because of the benefits of the serial testing in particular, and because of the pilots as well, we were pretty confident that we could do it.
So just to go back to the meeting where it was being said there wasn't robust delivery plans.
That was before that.
So, but in terms of delivery of what? Was that delivery of the more limited serial testing?
Yes.
Or was that... So even at that point, with the limited plan, that was the concern?
It was. I'd say two things about that. First, 6 days is an awfully long time in this period. We were moving things along hour by hour on a lot of these issues. And the second is, again, rightly, it is extremely common in government for people to say that each other's plans are not robust enough yet and to test them and kick them and push them. So I think there were worries about it. I think by the time we got to the 10th, the worry wasn't about whether we could. So there was as I say, there was still relatively close to that, a concern about whether or not enough lateral flow devices could be made available, and there was still work to do on the logistics. All of this was being done. If in normal times, in my day job, you asked me to set up a programme to administer a health test to a very large number of children in every school across the country, I would tell you it would take 3 years. That would be my starting estimate. So all of this is being done at extreme pace. But by the 10th, I think we were appropriately confident that we could deliver that serial testing and teacher testing proposal. And I can say that with quite a lot of confidence, because if you fast forward to what we actually did, and there's some more story in between, but schools reopened to vulnerable children, critical workers on the 4th, secondary and primary, and we had some primary schools open as well. By the 6th of January, 2 days after that, we had administered 47,000, a little bit more than 47,000 lateral flow tests in school settings, which, again, give or take, would have been more than enough to meet the expected demand on this first plan. So my level of confidence that we could execute that first plan is not theoretical. We did it. We did it under slightly different circumstances, having attempted something else. But I feel really secure in my judgment that had that remained the plan, we could have executed it, and I think we could have executed it really well. The second thing that happened then was that the Secretary of State for Health continued to press for a more comprehensive testing programme.
Can I just ask you to pause before we proceed to that, because I think there's just there is a factual issue here, in that the Secretary of State announced, there was a public announcement on the 15th of December that schools would be expected to roll out testing, and that's the serial testing that you're you've described. But we know that on the same day, on the 15th of December, there is this important paper that sets out the requirement, for example, to mobilise 49,000 people. And I think that's where there's a lack of clarity, whether or not when the public announcement was made, there were still, are these...
No, this is in relation to a new
Precisely.
plan.
Yes.
So this is why it's confusing.
Yes.
So on the day we were announcing that, we were under pressure to go further and do more. And the proposition that was made then was for testing on return of every secondary child, 2 tests within a week. And again, the scale of that is an order of magnitude different from the serial testing requirement. And that is why there were, even though the announcement was being made on the 15th of the first plan, there were papers circulating on the 15th which related to the second, more intense plan. And it was in relation to that plan that we were seriously worried we wouldn't have the workforce and the capability to deliver. And again, you can see in the papers both us trying to work out what we can do through the school workforce and us saying we really think we would need support to do this. There was then a third ask, which is for secondary pupils to be tested weekly. So both a test on return, 2 tests a week apart, and weekly testing thereafter, which again just further increases the ask in respect of testing.
Can I just ask you to pause, because I think that is suggestive of or relates to what Sir Gavin Williamson said about these increasing demands being placed on the Department for Education. This is in the context of transmission rates going up and the emergence of the Kent variant.
Yes.
Did you, I mean, you were party to all of this. Did those demands seem unreasonable in that context? Or was the issue the manpower that would be expected? I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it makes perfect sense.
The reasonableness of the testing ask and the reasonableness of how to man it.
Yes. So we entirely understood why more was wanted in the context of the infection picture. And we really wanted to do everything we could possibly do to keep schools open. But on the 15th and the 16th in particular, we were really worried about the practicalities of doing that. So we'd done, again, I'm not going to say it wasn't rapid work. It was rapid work, even for the first plan I described. But we got to the point where we had a pretty good idea how we would do that. But this was a huge extension of that. Now, and both I and the Secretary of State expressed that, and again, you can see that in the minutes of meetings. However, everybody involved in this, the Secretary of State for Health, Secretary of State for Education, me insofar as it is my place to have a view rather than to execute the things I'm told to do, and I do advise as well as execute, really, really wanted to do anything we could possibly do in order to keep schools open. So I want to explain that the requirement changed. I'm not actually complaining about it. I just want it to be clear. And what we did then, having expressed our anxiousness about it, was, and again, this might come across oddly, but we did what civil servants do, which is you give your best advice, and then when you're given an instruction, even if you think it's difficult, you execute it as well as you possibly can. So when we were asked to expand that, we went away and we ran at that problem as hard as we possibly could. I mobilised staff across the department and asked them to work over Christmas. We communicated to schools. It was a very, very difficult communication. We were asking something that I think felt deeply unreasonable to schools, and I really acknowledge that. But the context was that we were being told, if you want to keep schools open, you've got to go further and do more and make this happen. And by the time we get to the 29th of December, which was the day of the critical conversations around whether we needed to kind of essentially whether we could open, there was a conversation in which there were strong health voices advocating for a bigger delay to the return to school for infection management reasons. And because by the 20, and again, I know this sounds, again, in normal times, this sounds very odd, but between the 16th and the 29th, we had done a huge amount of work on this. We'd got the logistics organised with the delivery of this much larger number of tests. We'd issued guidance. We'd got ready to run webinars for staff. We had got some MACA support, not as much as we wanted. It was advisory rather than on the ground. But we were increasingly confident that we could deliver this greater level of testing. Again, we'd initially said it would be voluntary for schools to take up, and there was a push to make it more required, and we said we're going to have to accept this is a huge ask for them, and people will do it if they possibly can. But you will see us in the meeting on the 29th saying, actually, we think we can now do this much bigger ask, and if that's what it takes to keep schools open, we'll do it. And the compromise was a delay of a week with that testing in place. In some of the papers, it is presented as though the delay was necessary in order to get the testing stood up. That's not my recollection. My recollection is that people wanted the delay anyway for infection control reasons, and it would help. I mean, it certainly helped us. It made it easier. But there were a whole set of people who needed testing on the 4th of January, whatever we did, because the school was open for vulnerable children and the children of critical workers. And we did have test centres set up in the vast majority of schools by the 4th of January. We had lateral flow devices delivered to 97.2% of schools by the 4th of January. We tested 47,000 people, as I said, by the 6th of January. We ended up carrying out something like a quarter of all of the tests in the testing programme in school sites. And I think that testing programme was one of the most extraordinary things that was done in what was an extraordinary time, and I cannot emphasise enough how grateful I am to schools, to trusts, to teachers, to teaching assistants, to parent volunteers in large numbers who came together to make that happen, and actually also to my staff in the department who did that. And I think it is, again, there's a debate about how far the testing really made the difference, including in kind of whether that could have held infection in January. And I think it is the scientific consensus that it wasn't going to hold that position, but we didn't know that at the time we stood it up, and it did really help us to manage infection through the whole of that January to March period and to manage school return in March. And we continued to test on return at each point when schools came back after a break, and it increased both confidence and helped us to manage. And I just wanted to set out that there's quite a lot of it felt as though there was suggestion in there that the testing was badly done or badly organised, and I don't think that reflects the reality. I think the reality was that we were asked to do some very challenging things, that changed rapidly, and people rose to that challenge absolutely magnificently, and I wanted to say that.
I think what might be surprising about all of that is that it was left to schools, and that's not put as a criticism, that's put as obviously that would be a mammoth effort.
It was enormous.
So I think one of the things that obviously wasn't clear from the underlying papers, but I think can just about be worked out, that maybe there was military assistance of quite a small number of people.
About 1,500.
So small compared to the number of schools that, if you were going to help implement this sort of plan, would be available.
Yes, so we'd hoped. So if you go right back to those October pilots, there was military support for the pilots that was on the ground actually helping do the activity. And we had hoped for that as part of the rollout. And it became clear, again, in that slightly messy period in December that was, and again, we had a moment where there was a suggestion there might be 5,000 people available. It was, I think, already that was in the meeting papers, but already by the time the meeting took place, it was. So again, this is the 15th or 16th of December meeting. I think in the papers I say in the meeting, it's not clear that this is really a kind of solid offer. The MACA request was made. We did get support from about 1,500 people, but again, if you think about the number of schools there are across the country, that didn't mean a person in every school. It was a group of people who could give advice and support, and we had some sort of flying teams who could go if there was a particular difficulty. But it did fundamentally mean the core of the activity was in schools and by schools, and it was. I think it was an exceptional thing to ask. It would have been much better to have been able to find a way of not asking school staff to do that. But in the moment where the choice was, if this is going to happen, this is how it's going to happen, we lent as hard as we could into trying to make it happen, and we did.
And do you have a clear understanding as to why the support that might have been available wasn't made available?
So I think there was, I think there were a couple of reasons. I think there's a limited amount of MACA capacity, so there's a sort of straight question about how many people were available and all of the other things that they were being asked to do. There was, again, so as well as our several different testing plans during this period, there were a very large number of different plans put forward at various different points for mass community testing. And again, there was a mass testing event in Liverpool, which schools were part of and which was MACA supported because the whole thing was MACA supported. And I think that a bit as with the supply of the test devices, there were a lot of people in DHSC and the Cabinet Office trying to work out, and indeed in the Ministry of Defence, trying to work out how to deploy the available resource to all of the different requirements that were being made. And we were doing it at great pace. I don't know and didn't have visibility at the time of exactly what the other competing requirements were, but I wouldn't like to assume they weren't also very important.
And one of their other requirements will be doing their day job.
Correct. Yes.
And we made a lot of demands on the military, which they
Yes.
wouldn't normally expect during the pandemic.
Yes.
And I've heard a fair bit about it, things like PPE distribution
Yes.
and the like.
Yeah. And I should say the MACA support they did give us was extremely, hugely welcome and very helpful. And they did it very well.
In fact, my question had been about other sources of support that might have been available rather than just the military sources. Again, reading from the papers, it would appear that it was thought that the Department of Health or that there might have been able to mobilise assistance or test and trace. England
Yes.
may have been able to. It appeared that there were suggestions. There might
Yes.
have been other forms of support that didn't materialise.
Yes, so again, in that set of papers that suggested there might be some possibility of more MACA support, there was a list of other workforces that might be possible to mobilise. And again, we continue to engage with DHSC on that, but I think at the pace available, they were struggling to crystallise that into a kind of. And again, I really recognise that colleagues in DHSC were doing quite a lot of other things at the time. So again, we sought that additional help. We really tried to explore it, but in the end, the task was to do it as if we could possibly do it, and we knew that we could work with staff in schools and colleges. We had those links and connections, and we did deliver the programme.
Yes, I was going to say, because that comes back to the issue of what the confidence levels were in and around the start of January 2021 as to whether or not this could be delivered. it appears from your evidence that you did have that confidence from the work that you had been doing, that
Yes.
it was deliverable.
Yes, and I think the confusion arises partly because of the different plans. So on the 10th of December, I'm very confident, and that's because I'm delivering the first plan, which we've been working on over time. On the 15th and 16th, I'm very worried because the plan has changed. By the 29th, I'm much more confident even in the new plan because we've done some work.
I'm grateful. I'm going to move on to a different topic.
Of course. I'm sorry we took long on that. I hope it was helpful.
No, I think that it's been very helpful to have the clarity. May I ask you then about, again, these are two interrelated things really relevant to most children. And the first relates to remote education and its provision during the pandemic. We've heard obviously evidence about children not having access to devices, but then related issues about children's engagement with online forms of education, issues about how schools engaged with children in terms of remote education as well, so providing feedback, the ability to provide synchronous lessons, so a series of issues related to online education. So I wonder if you could summarise the department's evidence on what changed between the first and second set of school closures so that remote education became more engaging or more effective.
Yes, I'm very happy to do that. So, as we've covered, before the pandemic, remote education was not a formalised or widespread practice in England's primary or secondary schools. There were some schools that were making extensive use of technology in their teaching and others that were making very little. Initial focus, our initial efforts for that first lockdown focused on working with a wide range of partners to develop content that could be accessed whether through parents or through school office. So things like the partnership that we made with the BBC, with the setting up and development of the Yoke National Academy, work with Google and Microsoft on platforms, work to whitelist education websites so that they would not be counted in people's data usage, so they could be accessed for free, and ordering a first set of devices which was focused only on children with a social worker. And I can talk a bit more about why we didn't order more devices sooner.
Disadvantaged children in year 11 as well, so it may not have been quite as narrow.
It was, thank you, you're quite right. The priority order started with those disadvantaged children with a social worker, and that was about 220,000 laptops which were distributed during that first period. The logistics of getting hold of the laptops were a real challenge. Once you start sourcing in tens or hundreds of thousands, the laptops are being built for you, and almost none of them are built in this country. And so the flash to bang between ordering and getting a laptop involves somebody actually building the laptop and shipping it here. In terms of expectations set in that first period of the pandemic, there were some expectations set, and they were strengthened somewhat in June, and then work began over the summer to develop the temporary continuity direction, which was eventually enacted in October, which required schools to make provision for remote education. But I think it would be fair to say that the requirements focused on schools' flexibility in the first lockdown, recognising that not every child would have a device, recognising that teachers were teaching vulnerable pupils in school as well as trying to deliver remote education. I think our reflection over the summer and as we went into the autumn was that we needed to strengthen expectations. And we did that through the course of the autumn, including asking for minimum daily learning hours to be delivered for different ages of pupil, and making more requirements in terms of contact and feedback from teachers. And those were then enforced through the temporary continuity direction, which came into force in October 2020.
And was there, I may be able to cut through this a little bit, was there more understanding by the time of the second set of school closures as to what worked in terms of helping children to engage? I mean, the inquiry's heard some very serious evidence about, and it's also reflected in what children told the inquiry in its Children and Young Voices report, but about the real challenges that children might have in just, you might be online, but there are a whole lot of other things that are vying for your attention, which might make engagement in remote education rather harder. And I think it's trying to understand what makes the difference in that context.
Yes, and yes, so there was a lot of work, both formally and informally, to try and make sure that we were collecting and spreading good practice on what worked in delivering remote education. And so we had the Get Help with Technology programme, which was not just about the delivery of devices, but was about the giving of advice to schools on what worked. We had an Ofsted report which came out in January. We'd done some work on case studies which we'd circulated of good practice from schools, and that was not just about, as it were, use of the devices. It was about how to teach well through that medium and how to use blended combinations of live lessons, recorded lessons, and other types of work and contact.
And if I can just then put this in the context of this inquiry and looking to future pandemics.
Yes.
Can I ask you some questions about how you take that knowledge and how it's being used in order to ensure that teachers and schools might be ready in a future pandemic? So, for example, does that form part of teacher training, or is it part of updates in teachers' ongoing education? Are there ways it's being harnessed? So,
yes, we have a standing piece of guidance on remote education now, which learns the lessons from the pandemic, and which we do expect schools to use for short-term closures. And you saw that being in use, for example, when schools had to close in relation to RAC. The standing remote ed guidance which was there was used by schools to stand up provision for students when they couldn't be in school for short periods during that difficulty. We continue to have available all of that good practice. In terms of embedding in teacher training, I don't think we have embedded different expectations specifically on how you teach principally remotely in teacher training, but there is an awful lot more training and CPD available to teachers on use of technology more broadly.
That's, in fact, exactly what I was going to ask you, whether or not the position would be different now if there were a pandemic or a national emergency in terms of, I suppose, first of all, children's ability to access technology, and whether there are audits carried out, for example, or whether there is ongoing intelligence gathering about children's access to technology, and whether that's better understood now.
Yes, I think it's better understood. I think there is still a challenge, however. So we don't require schools to have a teaching model that, for example, involves one-to-one device use for children. Some schools do, many do not. There are more schools that make more use of devices now than there were before the pandemic. There are now certainly very few secondary schools that don't make use of some kind of online learning platform. So that challenge of schools without platforms, I think that is now has moved on
Yes.
very considerably. But I think it is still the case, and again, we've been testing this a little bit through the Pegasus exercise. I think it is still the case that if a pandemic broke out tomorrow, there would be children without access to a device, and we would need to work quickly to try and address that. I think we've done a lot more work on our sourcing and supply, but the challenge does remain that if you're sourcing devices in the hundreds of thousands or the millions, somebody needs to build them for you. You can't just pop down to PC World and get.
Yes. I think it's
several
more
hundred
about
thousand devices.
understanding the extent to which that is now a known as
It is.
opposed to an unknown, which it was at the time of the pandemic.
Yes,
so in other words, if this happened, we know we would need to do this.
Yeah, it's better known. I think we do assert, so we have better data on tech access. Again, it's quite unlikely on the basis of the data we have right now that we would know sort of to the child exactly who had a device and who didn't on the day the pandemic broke out. I'm really confident that we could get that information much more quickly than we did in the previous pandemic. And one of the things we're looking at, again, coming out of Pegasus, is whether we put even more in place around that understanding.
Because isn't that something, I mean, schools could audit those sorts of things presumably fairly
Yes.
easily on an ongoing basis, and there must be an issue about that in any event, given that children's access to technology may be generally important for their broader
Yes,
education.
and as I say, we would have a whole set of data series that would tell us year to year broadly how many children were using that. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
We'd have a good macro picture, but unlike the daily real-time data I now have on attendance, where I can literally tell you how many children were out of school in any school in the country you would like to choose yesterday and for what reason they were out of school and how that compares with the position the day before last week. I don't have that level of pinpoint accuracy real-time data on this issue. I could. There is a kind of how many things we ask the system to provide us in that level of detail.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to a different subject, if I may. And again, it's one you may have had some personal involvement with, and it's not an issue that the inquiry has touched on before. And it's about the appointment of Sir Kevin Collins and his plans for recovery after the pandemic. I probably don't need to take you to his plans because I think I can probably summarise that the most significant part of the plans that he produced were to extend the school day. Is that accurate to say that?
Yes.
It's not the only part of his plan, but it was probably one of the most significant aspects of what he was recommending the government did.
Yes, he framed his advice around 3 T's, teaching quality, time, and started off as tutoring and then became targeted support because it had extended slightly beyond tutoring, and time was the one. I think he would say they were all equally important actually, but the time one was a big proportion of the total overall cost.
I noticed on a slide that he prepared, he said, within successful school reforms, time is the single most powerful ingredient. But that was the point, I think, that, or maybe it boils down to, that was the most expensive element of the plans that he was proposing, correct?
Yes.
And can you assist us with the extent to which the Department for Education supported the plans that he produced for recovery?
Yes, so as quite often happens when you have an independent advisor of this kind, he had a team of civil servants from the department supporting him closely and helping him to develop the plan. So in a very sort of practical sense, it was colleagues from the department doing the work with him. And we worked and again, sometimes you do that and you sort of wall off the team and the independent advisor is very separate and then they sort of pop out with their recommendations and you look surprised. This didn't work like that. This was much better integrated. So he had his close team who were doing the work with him, but we were working in a very integrated way with him. There was there were really regular conversations. We were very supportive of the proposals, and we were, I think it would be right to say we were conscious from the start that because of the scale and the ambition of the proposal, we would have to be working really hard on making sure we were demonstrating the value for money of the proposals, particularly to the Treasury. But we were kind of seeking to do that with him.
And were you satisfied that I assume that testing then was put in place to be able to say not only is this workable, but it's value for money as well, and this is what it might produce at the end of it?
Yes. So ultimately, if I think the department, one of my jobs as the accounting officer for the department is that if I think we're about to do something that's really bad value for money, I have to try and stop it. But I would say, so there's a sort of straight, is it good enough value for money for the taxpayer to kind of reasonably support this? And it certainly met that test. I would say, though, that in negotiation with the Treasury, you don't get to do everything you think passes that value for money bar. The Treasury will also say, well, which of these things is the best value for money?
Yes.
So we supported the proposals. We recognised that there would be a conversation with the Treasury on that sort of sliding scale of value for money point. And I think we recognised with Kevin that the time proposals would be the part where the value for money argument was hardest to make.
And can you just explain what happened then in the discussions with the Treasury about the plan, which was supported by the department? So
there were a series of So right from very early on, Sir Kevin was transparent with the Prime Minister about the scale of the package that he was thinking about. So he talked about, certainly early on, there was a sort of 10 to 12 billion range that he described to the Prime Minister in one of the weekly notes that he sent him, and I think that's in the documentation. And Treasury knew that was the sort of scale being described. And again, in fairness to them, they said right from the start, this is not realistic. We aren't going to be able to provide that level of funding.
Yes.
However, it is also true that at the start, the Prime Minister said, and again, I paraphrase, yes, I am looking for really big, really ambitious proposals. Keep going. So from quite early on in the process, there was a pair of messages. And again, this is not particularly unusual, and to some extent it represents people in government playing their appointed roles and doing their jobs. But we were getting the message from Number 10 that we should be ambitious, and from the Treasury that we were thinking about spending too much money.
Yes. And I think the final outcome of it was that there was a much, much more reduced package than the one that had been advocated for by Sir Kevin. Yeah,
so the most important parts of the proposal on teaching, which was a massive expansion of teacher training, both for new teachers, so what is called the early career framework, which is the support we give teachers in the first 2 years of their career, and national professional qualifications, which is training for more senior teachers and for leaders. The propositions he made on that were accepted. The propositions that he made on tutoring were accepted. And in the initial announcement, the Prime Minister asked that the considerations about time be remitted and thought about harder and put through the spending review process. And eventually, as a result of that, we secured a bit more than £800 million for an expansion of time in 16 to 19, but not anything for expansion of time in schools. We did, however, introduce a minimum requirement for the length of the school day at 32.5 hours. So we didn't increase time, but we did effectively ask every school to meet what was then the average being provided, because one of the things that became clear through the work that Sir Kevin did was that both there was a wide variation in the length of school days, and that it wasn't something that we had looked at or codified for some time before that.
I think the stenographer heard, and I did too, 800 billion. It was 800 million.
Sorry, yes. I'm so sorry. Yes. That would have been magnificent. No.
I'm very grateful to you for clarifying that, and that it's helpful to understand them, because we've seen reflected in your evidence the point about the additional time being provided for 16 to 19-year-olds. It helps understand
Yes.
why that came about.
And I just will briefly say, so there's always a risk that 16 to 19 and further education in particular get overlooked in these conversations. The reason we were successful in arguing for the extra time for 16 to 19 was that, unlike nearly every other country around the world, and indeed unlike the historic position, we as a country fund and support less time for our 16 to 18-year-olds than for our 5 to 16-year-olds. Nearly everywhere else in the world, they offer more teaching time for those older children, and we offer less. So in choosing where to put that funding, they put it in that place. I think, again, if you accept that there were constrained resources, I think that wasn't a bad decision.
We might come to that, and some of the young people who had disproportionately difficult experiences during that period, and those being children who were in that age group or coming up to it. Before I do, though, may I touch briefly on some issues that were raised by Sir John Coles in his evidence? I understand that you're familiar with and understand the point that he made about assessment in summer 2020 and the attempts that he made to engage with the Department for Education in respect of that. And in the course of his evidence, he explained about his engagement with Sir Gavin Williamson, but I also, if I summarise more broadly, was critical of the department and its, I suppose, willingness to listen about the points that he was seeking to make. Did you want to respond to that in terms of the Department for Education's, whether it accepts that characterisation of its response?
Yes, I think there were two things I wanted to say about that. So the first is, I think there's always a risk that when you're in a position of relative power and ability to influence, such as when you are in a government department, that you don't take seriously enough and listen hard enough to the views of others. But I really see in the documents people trying to, giving Sir John a lot of time and a lot of attention and seeking to hear from him and listen to him. I also think that there was a lot of it can be a little bit difficult when you can see and have explained to you one person's input and one set of interactions. I think it's important to understand that was happening in the context of a lot of people having a view about this, including many views that were directly pulling in different directions. And so the department was not, I don't think it's a correct characterisation to say the department wasn't listening. I think it was listening to lots of people who had many different views and trying to kind of internalise and manage them. I do think the second thing I'd like to say is that, and again, as I explained at the beginning, my very first few days in the department were entirely absorbed in thinking about what had happened over the summer on exams, and the task I was set was to understand that, to try and manage the consequences which were still continuing when I arrived, and to plan for the following year's exams. And so I did quite a lot of work, including on the formal lessons learnt work that we did around this. And I think it is worth saying that absolutely everybody involved in the process thought that some form of standardisation or moderation process was needed, including Sir John, whose alternative proposal was a proposal that involved a slightly different kind of standardisation than Ofqual had put in place. And my conclusion from having looked at the evidence was that even if you had had a different form of standardisation and modernisation, and even if it made less change to pupils' results than the Ofqual proposal, I am not at all convinced that it would have stood. I think there was a fundamental problem in seeking to assign grades to students that they couldn't see as being directly related to their work. And where you had allowed teachers to give a judgment and the student knew what that judgment was, I think anything that attempted to change that judgment would have been found to be unacceptable under those circumstances. I completely understand why everybody thought some standardisation was necessary, and I also don't agree that this was some kind of tussle between people who care about fairness and people who are sort of mechanically attached to the standardisation of grades as a good in itself. Fairness matters between years as well as within years. So caring about standards maintenance isn't instead of caring about fairness, it's a form of caring about fairness. And I therefore think that it was completely understandable that everybody wanted to try and make sure they were holding on to that. But I find it very difficult to see that any form of adjustment would have worked, and yet every single person involved in that debate thought we should be trying to do some form of adjustment. And the result of that is that what we've put in place for the future is, again, a standing requirement that every year schools keep a sufficient sample of pupil work through the year that if they were to have to assign grades on this basis in the future, it could be clearly tied to pupils' work, and any moderation could be clearly tied to pupil work as well.
I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to cut over you. Looking at it from the child's perspective, if you had reached March of 2020 and you'd been studying for your A-levels, working really hard, and were told overnight that none of that would stand and that your future was going to be decided by some unknown process, as you say, divorced from potentially everything that you had been doing, and that must have been incredibly difficult for those children.
Yes.
Do you accept that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And do you think the better course then in that year would have been just to go with teacher-assessed grades and to live with the inflation?
I think so. And again, I've thought about this a lot. I think it's really hard to see a really good answer if you start from there rather than starting further back. And again, this comes back to sort of the more planning you can do further in advance and the more contingency you can put in advance, the easier. I think with the massive benefit of hindsight, and again, I sort of always remember throughout all of this period and all of our reflection on it. So Sir Mark Walport, who was the Chief Scientific Advisor right at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember him saying the most powerful instrument in our scientific armoury is the retrospectoscope. And I'm sort of acutely conscious that it's easy to do this through the retrospectoscope. But I think if I'd been doing it, I would have, knowing what I know now, and somehow mysteriously, despite knowing what I know now, not having put in place the things that we put in place, I think I would have attempted to do something that, as it were, did the algorithm first and the teacher judgment later. In other words, that said, here is what we think a reasonable range of grades for your institution looks like. Do your teacher assessment, but be aware that if you're outside that range, we're going to come and have a bit of a look. And so I think I'd have tried to do some more anchoring in advance so that you didn't have the situation where you had a teacher judgment which then felt overruled, but instead you tried to do some anchoring and then asked teachers to do their judgment within the anchoring. And I think you would still have seen significant inflation, and I think you would still have seen schools taking quite different approaches within that. So some schools would have stretched the envelope more than others. I think it would have still been deeply imperfect, but I think I'd have had a crack at it that way round.
I'm grateful. The other point that Sir John Coles raised was his, and it's documented at the time, his attempts to provide advice as a member of the recovery group. And we saw him sending emails at 2:00 in the morning and asking the question, is my advice going anywhere? Because the policies that come back don't seem to take that into account. Was there an issue during the pandemic with the department's ability to integrate that sort of practical advice? Or was the problem simply that the policy shifts were so quick that sort of advice couldn't be meaningfully used?
I think it was much more the latter. Again, you're always synthesising and integrating lots of people's advice. And so even when you've done a synthesis, some people will feel that they haven't been heard as well as others. Sir John's experience and pedigree, we take him very seriously in the department, as rightly we should. I think the other thing I have some sympathy with colleagues on is the business of again, in normal times, we would really try and go back to everybody and say, yes, you said this is what we did, this is why we've taken this bit and not that bit. I think the pace and the intensity of work during this period, and again, some of what he describes is before my time in the department, but I think it is very, very likely that people were just struggling to manage to find the time to do that level of feedback.
But also because shifts were being driven from outside the department as well.
Yes.
I want to come on then, if I may, to impacts. Very broadly, just to consider what the Department for Education regards as being the persistent impacts of the pandemic on children. Can I start with children in elective home education and the figures as they now stand? You've set out in your witness statement the current position is that there are 92,000 children who are who are said to be being home educated. May I ask, first of all, does the department accept that there is a link between that increase in the number of children being home educated and the pandemic?
Yes. And again, I say that slightly cautiously because the numbers were rising before the pandemic, but we certainly saw a very significant increase during and after the pandemic.
And is that part of the broader cultural issue that some witnesses have pointed to, that there has been this damage done to the contract between schools and families and the expectation that you go to school?
Yes, I think that's certainly quite a significant part of it. I should say, it's very important to say, we don't as a department regard elective home education as a sort of inherently bad thing. There are many people who home educate for very good reasons and who do it extremely well. And so again, we tend to try to be a bit careful not to sort of speak about it as though like everything about it is terrible. But we do worry a bit about whether people have felt forced into elective home education. We worry about a small subset of those who are electively home educating who may wish their child to be off the radar of services for reasons that are less positive than that. And again, I just need to be incredibly clear that I'm not saying that I think that is the case for the vast majority of home educators, but I think it is a part of the picture. And we also do worry about, again, in some cases, we worry about the comprehensiveness and effectiveness of the education being.
Yes. And forgive me, I didn't mean to suggest that there are people
I know.
who don't have
I really know
legitimate...
you didn't. It is one of the topics on which I know I have to be very careful. So
and really it's just a reflection of the Ofsted concern about the numbers of children and the background to some of the children who are being home educated.
Correct.
And the fact that a proportion of those children are vulnerable children.
Yes. And we worry about that very much. And you can see the provisions in the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill, which is currently before Parliament, which seek to address some of those concerns.
That's a question that I wanted to ask you about. The inquiry understands that the register of children who are being home educated is one of the things that the bill contemplates will happen. Ofsted have raised the concern in the inquiry about whether or not it will have access to that register. Is that an issue that's being worked out in the detail of the bill?
Yes.
The other broader issue then that arises is persistent absenteeism arising out of the pandemic, and the proportion of persistent absenteeism having increased quite sharply. But I think from your evidence, some signs that that might be starting to recover. Is that correct?
Yes, we have three different measures we look at, three principal measures we look at on attendance. There's overall attendance, which rose very significantly during the pandemic and has since been coming back down again, including about 5 million more school days attended in total last year than the year before, which is one of the fastest year-on-year improvements on record. The second is persistent absence, and the definition of persistent absence is a child that is missing one school day every 2 weeks, so a tenth of their time in school. And that also rose very significantly during the pandemic, and that is also now reducing. And the third is severe absence. And severe absence we define as children missing more than half of school. And that is a much, much smaller number. So it's about 2.3% at the moment of children miss half of school or more. But that is the one that is still going up. It's not yet started to come down. And we know that when we have significant rises in persistent absence, we see that feed through into later severe. So again, like maths as well as human behaviour says, it's quite difficult to become severely absent if you haven't passed through being persistently absent. And so at the moment, that rise still looks like it's the lagged tracking of the rise in persistent absence. And we hope that having turned the corner on persistent absence, we'll start to see severe absence turn. But we are working really hard to try and make that happen. And schools across the country are doing so too. And again, the work that teachers, head teachers and others have done during and after the pandemic to try and address some of these challenges is phenomenal. And I want to take the opportunity to say thank you on behalf of the department to them.
Thank you. Your statement is incredibly detailed as to elements of the effect on children's attainment. Yes. And it's not controversial, so I'm not going to take you through the detail of that. But I think broadly speaking, it's accepted on behalf of the department that overall the pandemic did harm the attainment of all pupils, and particularly those who are subject to the disadvantage gap. Is that an overall accurate summary of what's accepted?
Yes, so it harmed education attainment for the average child, but more for those from poorer backgrounds. It reversed at a stroke about a decade's worth of work to close the gap in attainment between children who receive free school meals and their peers. With the determination and work of teachers and leaders, as I described, that is gradually recovering, but it has not yet recovered, and it is being done with effort and difficulty.
The expert to Module 8 has set out in her evidence that her view that as a general picture, the disadvantage gap is still widening. Is that the most recent statistics for the Department for Education, I think, demonstrate that in fact that recovery that you allude to has started and can be seen reflected in the most recent data, correct?
Yes, again, the picture is very slightly different depending on which set of results you look at, but broadly speaking, we can see the gap now narrowing again. It is not yet closed to, it's not yet closed to where it was before the pandemic, but it is going in the right direction.
The other thing that the expert to Module 8 said was that there's a consensus that school closures triggered by the pandemic have had a severely detrimental effect on learning and attainment. again, I wanted to ask if you accept that subject to the evidence of recovery in the most recent data.
Oh, certainly school closures impacted attainment. I mean, the pandemic is an incredibly good illustration of why we have schools.
Yes. I think it's really her severely detrimental effect on learning and attainment. So I think it's just...
It had a much severer effect for some children than others, but I think I'm not sure it's profitable to have an argument about the word severe.
And do you accept, and of course there's a differential in the experience of disadvantaged children during the pandemic, but do you accept that overall for most children during the pandemic that it had a severe impact on their education as well? I'm conscious that there are children in private schools who may have had more access, obviously, to online education. So I'm talking about the mainstay of children in state schools.
Yes, I mean, the only reason I hesitate on this, so I think it did have a severe impact on the education of children, including children whose education was relatively well served. I don't think that remote education is a good substitute for face-to-face education. I think the pandemic demonstrated that even when well executed, it was very hard to make it substitute. I mean, not least because school provides a lot more than education. I would say that when you look at the performance in the state system of children who are not from deprived backgrounds, we're on many measures we've recovered. We have not recovered for children from more vulnerable children from those more deprived backgrounds, and so that's why I'm just marginally hesitated over severe impact for everybody. I think it did actually have a severe impact for everybody, but I think that the lastingness of the impact was different across those different contours. And the other thing I would say is we tread this quite careful line all the time between making sure we recognise impacts, disadvantages and vulnerabilities in the system, and that we do not accidentally slide into reducing our expectations for children from those backgrounds. Because the literature is so compelling that the expectations teachers, parents and we as a society have are really material in how children do. So if we accidentally project the message that these children cannot recover their education, that they're scarred forever, that we risk actually making that more true than it would have been if we continued to realistically hold the highest possible expectations. And again, I'm sorry to sort of harp on this, but head teachers I speak to, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, we're thinking about this really hard, and we're trying to manage children's aspirations and parents' aspirations in an environment where a lot of people in the world were projecting this really quite strong message that, you know, all was lost for a generation. And it's not about being Pollyanna-ish or suggesting that there wasn't a problem. There really was a problem. It was really serious. But recovery for children is aided more by us asserting their entitlement to an education which sets really high expectations for them and helps them to meet those really high expectations than it is by a narrative that says that it's hopeless or can't be done.
Thank you. I just wanted to put something to you from the inquiry's Every Story Matter report, which brings together the experiences of people, including those who work in education. And one head teacher in England said it, referring to the pandemic, developed a feeling that actually we can do just fine without school, and therefore I don't really need to come. Attendance is at the worst ever nationally currently as a result. And I just wanted to ask you about whether you agree that one of the principal issues to come out of the pandemic is understanding that real relationship, I suppose, between continuing to attend school and the potential damage that can be done by disrupting that. And I think there's a second part to that, the very long-term consequences it can have as well.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think there's wider and more multifaceted pieces of. I do think there's been damage to that sort of social contract, but I think we've got incredibly good, very clear survey evidence that there are more parents who think that missing a bit of school doesn't matter, and actually we also have incredibly clear evidence that every day really does count. That, for example, the difference it makes to your grades to go from being a 95% attender to a 90% attender is really significant, and actually is as significant as any other 5% gap. And re-communicating that and helping people hold on to that and understand it is a big job of work. There's also a huge impact on other people's children when children are casually absent. So the teacher has to invest time in catching up the children who've been absent. The class will often go back round things. So people also, I think, don't necessarily appreciate that the impact on their own child may not be just about their own child's absence. Both their child's absence can affect other people's children, and that other people's children's absence can affect their child.
Thank you. My lady, it's almost, I think, time for the short adjournment.
Certainly. Very well, we shall return at 1:45. Thank you very much.